Hello, everybody. This is Johns Hopkins with Baltimore Heritage, and we are here again with one of our 5-minute histories videos. And today we're going to talk about Dickeyville. And I just have to begin by sharing my first encounter with Dickeyville. I had just moved to Baltimore, and this was many years ago, and we had a pretty good snow. And I asked a colleague and friend, a gentleman named Kevin Baines, who knew a lot about Baltimore. I said, Kevin, where can I go cross-country skiing? We've got a lot of snow. And without hesitation, he said, go out to Leakin Park, take the Gwynns Falls Parkway, and there are a couple trailheads and parking lots, and then head out. There are a lot of trails. And lo and behold, I did that. Parked my car, got on my skis, headed up an old road that had been closed for what looked like many years. And in about 10 minutes, I popped out into the quaintest village in the English Cotswolds that you've ever seen. And that, of course, was Dickeyville. I went back the next day very excited to Kevin and said, Kevin, you'll never believe what's out in West Baltimore. And he laughed at me and said, Johns, that's Dickeyville. That's what we're going to talk about today. So I thought we'd go through a little bit of a timeline and then take a virtual tour of some of the houses and buildings in Dickeyville. And the timeline really starts in the 1660s when a gentleman named Richard Gwynn, Gwin, gets permission to build a homestead where Dickeyville is today and trade with the Native Americans, who I believe they were Algonquin. If you recall, on the other side of town in the 1660s was when David Jones built his farmstead on what's now called the Jones Falls River. So we have sort of two pioneering families who are out in opposite ends of the city building their homesteads. Gwynn, and we are sure that this is the Gwynn of Gwynns Falls Parkway, Gwynns Falls, the river named after him. How it got from Gwin to Gwynn, I'm not sure. But as a bad speller, I am really thrilled every time I come across old letters and people are spelling their own names 5 ways to Sundays in the same way, in the same letter. So I'm pretty sure it's just a different spelling of Gwynn. And he is out there doing his thing for a good long time until about 1720, when the first mill was built by his brother-in-law. And that was a grist mill. It was milling flour and grains. And that lasted for almost 100 years as just a mill. It was no real village yet until about 1808, 1810. And that's when the first houses start to appear. And we start to get the village of what would become the village of Dickeyville. 1808, I think, is when the oldest house was. By 1810, there is, in addition to a grist mill, there is the Franklin paper mill. And then by 1814, there's also the Franklin woolen mill. So now we've got all sorts of different mills. And if you know one of Dickeyville's neighboring neighborhoods, it is Franklintown. And that's the Franklin family that built those early mills. And the milling operation goes on under the Franklins until the 1830s, when the Wethered's family buys the mill complex. If you know the main road leading into Dickeyville, it's called Wetheredsville Mill. And the Wethered's expand the village. They build workers' houses. They build a school. They start to really expand it. And that goes on until 1872. And that's when a gentleman named John Dickey buys the entire mill complex, and I think most of the houses as well. And he again expands it, and the houses that he builds are sympathetic to the now what are 60, 70-year-old stone mill workers' houses. But it's still called Wetheredsville or Wethered's Mill until he dies in the 1890s, and in his honor, the town changes name to Dickeyville, John Dickey. It goes through a bunch of stages. By the Great Depression in the 1930s, it takes a big hit as the mills are shutting down. Interestingly, during that time, some of the mill buildings, in a very early example of adaptive reuse, artists are taking over some of the old mill buildings, including a muralist with the last name McCall, who we covered, I think, in a prior video. And you can see one of his great works, The Birth of the National Anthem at Fort McHenry. In 1918, the mill, Dickeyville, is annexed by Baltimore City. It was all the way out in Baltimore County. And then in 1934, a group of developers buys the entire village and does a wonderful restoration and of buildings. This is the same era that John D. Rockefeller is building Colonial Williamsburg, collecting old historic houses and rehabbing existing ones there. So this same era of hearkening back to sort of our colonial roots. And today, of course, Dickeyville is a fantastically charming neighborhood in Baltimore City. So let's take a little bit of a stroll, and I'm gonna read the addresses of houses and just say a few words about them. We'll go pretty lickety split here. I do have to say thanks to a friend of mine and a Baltimore Heritage volunteer, Pat Hawthorne. When we were able to do tours in person, Pat, who lived in Dickeyville at the time, hosted us, and we had what was one of the most fantastic tours. Also, one of the wettest tours on record. It poured down rain, but thanks to Pat, here we go with just about maybe 6 or 7 houses. 2500 Pickwick Road, the 2500 block, is a row of 6 stone houses in the earliest period of the building of the village, in the early 1800s, when a family named Schutte owned the mills. These houses, if you know Stonehill in Baltimore, the little neighborhood back behind the Steve Silver building off of I-83, or Woodbury, these are the same mill workers' houses styles that you'll see there. Walking on over to 5122 Weathersville Road, built in 1810s, one of the earliest houses also. Wonderful fieldstone house, gives you a flavor of what Dickeyville is like. Moving into the next sort of era, the Weatheridge era in the 1830s, 5002 Weathersville Road. It was built as a schoolhouse, and it's now a private residence, a charming place. And 2412 Pickwick, built in 1853 for the International Order of Oddfellows, and now is used as a community space. Finally, wrap up in the sort of final period, the Dickey period, in the 1870s and 1880s. 2423 Pickwick was a mill warehouse, and now is artist studios. It was built in the 1870s. And 2407 to 2411 Pickwick Road, which is really basically the heart of Main Street, Dickeyville. These wonderful stone row houses were built in the 1870s. And finally, 2435 Pickwick, which was the mill office and jail, built in the 1870s when the mills were still running strong. So don't wait for a big snowstorm. I encourage you to get out there and take a drive through, or better yet, put on your mask and take a walk through, and certainly experience one of Baltimore's most charming neighborhoods, rivaling anything that the English Cotswolds can throw at us. Thanks so much, and we'll see you next time.